Welcome, gentlemen. Actually, I think this is the first of this particular combination.
It is that.
I've been with all of you in different configurations, but just this one, the four of us together, I think is the first time. So I want to welcome the dynamic that's about to show itself.
Right. I got swapped in for Jordan Hall. That's one way of putting it. In the deal logo.
He was this close from having him
here.
join us at 1, but he can't do it.
Okay.
I'm talking to him later. So one of the reasons I actually wanted to, I sent you guys an email to get together and talk about this is that I happen to have something coming up that's really seems to hit on all the things that we've been in constant conversation about, right? Which in the situation is in my company, the Circling Institute, circling, which is you could say is it's a relational practice, right? Kind of like if you took like whatever it is that makes relationships profound and life-changing and you made a yoga out of that, that's basically what circling is. And it's a lot more than that, but and I've always in the way that I've done it, I had always done it in person, right, in California, and been doing that for years and teaching people how to do it for years, and it spread in that way. And then for me, when COVID came on, was when it forced us to do what I was intending to do but resistant to do, is to start doing it online. And I've always been pretty skeptical of it being online. But I've been really, really surprised, first of all, that it could happen on Zoom, and it could happen pretty much all of it can happen, right? And even some of it, I would say, is more intensely because of the way that the frames magnify a particular aspect of us that you don't get when you're in person. So actually some of the changes in dynamic actually increase some of the impact of the practice. But the most recent development is now that I realize oh, okay, well, first of all, we may not be able to contact each other for quite a while. This may be a new normal on some level, who knows? And so now most of the people that are coming and participating are from all over the world, which is amazing. So we're moving, what we're including and what we're going to be doing next is like a membership part of it. And it's basically what it's going to consist of is that, people with a membership will just there'll be various circling related practices throughout the day that people can just come to and pop into. And it's interesting. There's one level where I was like, oh yeah, that just seems like just a good thing. And then I started thinking about to what degree that just making it open that way, right, and a frame around it is very much like something like a town square, right? That it's not just, I got the sense that it's not just going to be that it's going to be more convenient for people to go to, right? It's not going to just be the fact that people from different time frames can go and consume more of it or participate in more of it. But that the very thing itself is, I have a feeling it's going to be one of those things a year from now, I'm going to look back on what that did to circling, how I understood the practice, is that I was actually, this is going to be a world. This creating boundaries is going to be something like a world. And then I was just kind of tracking my thinking around it. And then I was just kind of starting to think about this, wow, if it's a world, first, I want to put as much consciousness. It's kind of strange to be able to set up a world, to be able to do that. First of all, I don't know if we've ever been at a time where we've been able to do that in this way. And and if we do, like, to do it with the presuppositions that can possibly form a world that's like really, really cool. And what it's addressing, and like, and of course that starts to bring together all of the notions that we've been talking about, right? About this Gregg, about like the what do you call it, the self-justification, sociality, the way that you talk about that, right? This justify how we become persons, right? And John, there's a way that you laid out in one of your most recent meditation talks, you know, when you were laying out you're basically, you mapped out the fount of intelligibility, right? Of logos, and where you were, there was a way that you talked about sociality in the between the lower and the higher, and that something about the social relationships, right, is where that fount would kind of come out in these different dynamics. And then Chris, in all of our conversations, which we have many, which I love, right? You've been saying this thing lately. You're like, you know, this dialogos thing, I'm starting to wonder, like, how much can it be done without the fellowship, like with this sense of fellowship? What is this relationship with the fellowship and the dynamic of the dialogos that comes up? And then I mean, I'll talk to you guys for any reason, so if that started to look like enough of an excuse for me to get us together and start talking about some of these things.
Cool.
Yeah. So and the thing about, you know, what I have come to understand, especially in terms of that, for me, the work around circling has been in ways that I didn't really quite understand at the time, and don't know if I still totally understand all the way. Which is that there's something about the grounding in that, in whatever it is that circling touches on, seems to afford dialogos, right? Which I think is what gets back to what Chris may be talking about, like that that if there's not a sense of personal intimacy in some way, right? Whatever that is, right? If there is not a sense of thou-ness, let's say, like the other person actually can break through as a legitimate other, in which I feel things like respect and love and all of those kinds of things with, you know, can a dynamic such as dialogos, right, that is somehow beyond even the personal or the transpersonal sometimes, right? Like the thing where we start to hear, I start to hear not just what you're saying, but I start to hear the spot right before the word that you're saying things from, and then start to respond to that, right? That there's this connection between sociality, right? And also, one of the things I found out in writing this paper that we all wrote the book that we're writing together, I really I didn't really understand to what degree circling was as much a reflection of the shift in sociality that's happened in the world with social media, right? Until I wrote that paper and really got like, oh my God, I don't think circling would have even made sense before the internet necessarily, and the focus that it has about needing a practice in which you do the basics of relating. Because it seemed like life inherently had enough of it to go around, even if it wasn't that good, who knows, but like it had enough of it. And there's something about that produces the identity and the personalities that then relate with those things. And that when you start to eliminate a lot of the necessities of that through texting and through social media, you start to literally start to eliminate or make optional those things that make human beings, right? In some regard. And thus a practice called circling can actually be seen and be responded to even before it understands what it's doing. And so there's another level of so just to give some breadth about some of the things about circling, I think why circling even makes sense at this point, right? Especially now that it's also going to be a thing where people get to come and actually participate in relationship where most of it's optional, right?
Okay.
So those are my thoughts. I'll just let that sit and take root, and whoever wants to pick it up.
There'd be lots of possible pickups. I'll throw some things out there and then we can see. So here's some of what was coming to my mind. So the changing cultural ecology of the meaning crisis and where we are, we're trying to figure out how to socialize ourselves so we keep our souls in sort of the craziness of the world, and we're longing for that. We're hungry for that. So that's, and then we drop something like circling in. So for me, when I hear circling, I hear a number of different things. And I'm not steeped in the practice, but as a clinical psychologist and where I'm positioned, I think I pick it up. But one of the things is like that I was thinking as you talked about sort of our base humanity and then becoming persons was what's called the circle of security. I'm not sure if the circle of security is the basic framework for understanding attachment theory. Okay. And basically what it is the parent then creates a safe haven so that in a secure base that the child can then go out and explore and can be seen in the context of their exploration, individuation, and then be held. Yeah. And from my vantage point, what we track is our relational system is starting to come online, and we're getting mirrored, and we're internalizing the parent, and we're tracking whether or not we're known and valued and safe. Yeah. And if so, we'll have a secure sense of that. And if not, we'll have an insecure, and that can operate in lots of different and troubling developmental ways. Yeah. And then as I had that image, I had the connection to what John and Jordan were talking about, both in relationship, this most recent conversation, I just happened to go for a walk and caught about half of it, both in terms of initially fellowship and the connection of the individual to the group, then in a context, and then now a hypermedia context, and then ultimately sort of how do we cultivate the right kind of religion that's not a religion, that allows us to artfully cultivate the relationships and then explore dialogos so that we can figure out what the hell we're doing in this very new context.
Yeah, yeah.
Thanks, Greg, for mentioning that link. Yeah, that conversation, I've been pursuing some conversations with Jordan, and we're kind of trying to figure out how to get back into those conversations schedule-wise, around these issues, around the notion of fellowship as having a way of dynamically balancing between the two poles of individuation and participation. And that's how we're trying to understand. And then, but it's not only the two poles. Fellowship is also, you think of the standard examples like the Fellowship of the Ring. You're not just balancing between those, they're balancing because everyone involved is being called into service, called in to serve something that is beyond them. And then what I proposed as a possible connection to that is, and it's sort of the connection between wisdom as being called to something, a greater reality, and these kinds of practices is, the question I was bringing up was a question that I've been rereading some of the dialogues with a friend of mine, Dan Chiappi, and just I'm doing so much research also on Socrates for the After Socrates project. And this idea keeps coming back to me, and I sort of, it's even in Plato's Seventh Letter, and I get it at one sense and I don't get it at another. And the issue was, yes, I want to balance individuation against participation, so people are called into service, self-transcendence, wisdom, but this notion of how we can, Heidegger's notion of Mitsein, how we can be together such that we can catch virtue from each other. And it's this idea of catching virtue that was really catching me, because what comes out, right? And this is in the dialectic practice, right? What keeps coming out is you can't teach virtue, but you can't just leave people unexposed to virtue, right? It's like Plato keeps coming back again and again on this problem. You can't teach it, That doesn't make any sense. But you can't just let people run off their intuition, because they'll go awry, they'll fall prey. And so the question that keeps coming to me, and it's a complex question, is how do we balance individuation and participation so that we're in service, but how does that service and that balance look like it needs to be in order so that we can catch virtue from each other? Because if we can't figure out how to catch virtue from each other, and this is what Jordan and I keep sort of, and this is why, as Gregg said, we get into the religion that's not a religion, because religions have this capacity that you catch religion from other people. We catch culture from each other, right? I understand we have things like catechism, but man, if you already don't, and this is something Chris has emphasized, if you don't already have that huge amount that you've already caught and internalized, the catechism isn't going to make any difference. You can write the most beautiful constitution in the world, and if the culture hasn't caught the normativity, you can see what's happening right now, right? And so the question that comes to my mind about this, and Guy, this is a long way of talking about what I think a world does for us, is a world balances individuation off against participation. It puts us in service of a greater reality, and it calls us into a fellowship whereby we can catch virtue from each other. Now that's the problematic that I am really putting a lot of thought and effort into right now, trying to, and the central metaphor, and it keeps coming back and back, is right, this catching of virtue. What does that look like? What does that mean? And it seems to me that there seems to be a deep relationship between the way we catch the logos in circling and dialogos and the way we catch virtue. And that seems to be one of Socrates' main claim. He's willing to be caught by the logos, and in being willing to follow the logos, that's how he helps people catch virtue. And so that's what I'm on right now. And the inarticulate noise is probably the best thing I just said. So there you go.
No, I don't think that's the best thing you said. I think you said a lot of good things, but I'll let Chris see if he wants to pick up on that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. There's so many different things that are coming up here. So there's a quote that I think it's Goethe has a quote. He says, "You can only learn from those you love," and I find that very interesting. And obviously, there are all kinds of ways in which that can be misinterpreted and maybe made facile. But in this context, you you made that reference to the fellowship, John, the fellowship of the ring, and this idea that really what summons all of the participants to be in company with one another is a shared recognition of the call that you've described, right? The call of ascent, the call of ascendancy. And that what really binds them into continuity in relation to one another is the recognition of the call reflected by and between one another. But there's a way in which that actually has to be in process to be recognized, right? So if I can use kind of a visual metaphor, there's something company, the sense of being with and being known by and knowing of others is very different when you share a situation of some kind of motion, some kind of vectored direction, right? When you're actually on a pilgrimage with a group of people, or even just one person, your sense of being with them is very different than when it's ultimately sedentary or configured in a more kind of quotidian way. Yeah. And so there's something to me, some of what I'm hearing here is that some of what actually is necessary for the kind of love we mean when we say that somehow the process needs to, the concinnity of the different participants, the way that they're actually bound together has something to do with the anagogic eros, right? That has something to do with the project of reciprocal love. But somehow I have this intuition that actually doesn't catch its traction unless there's already a kind of moving analogy, a kind of direction that the entire practice is taking, that the thing we're in needs to be moving of itself, and so our motion within it needs to be connected to its motion. Well, and that's why depictions of fellowship involve, So depictions of fellowship are projected, right? They're projected onto the horizon. They're not stationary. And so there's some, and so that, you know, like for instance, what we're doing here wouldn't seem nearly so meaningful if we didn't have the intuition that it were somehow, a branch of, that was a completely accidental nod to your tree, Greg, but it's an appropriate one perhaps.
I'll take it.
You'll take it. But it wouldn't be nearly as meaningful if it didn't seem to be a species of a parent that was greater than it, and that it didn't seem to be growing in the direction of that parent, or at least growing in recognition to it. And so, Guy, you know, you said to me in a conversation a few weeks ago, you were saying, you know, the thing that makes you feel known is not that what you've said is known, is that the thing that you are, to which you are responding in the saying of what you say, is known. And that's very difficult to get unless there is a shared sense of motion that actually to capture all of us together, and to which we have specific individuated responses that can be known in relation to the whole. Sorry, that was just sort of a cacophony of different things, but that's what occurs to me.
I just want to add to that the observation of the long-standing and deep association between walking together and doing philosophy together. This is a long-standing thing. And then there's another association that comes to my mind right now, is the ongoing discussions I have with Rafe Kelly about the increasing convergence between movement practices as a spiritual practice, as an ascesis, mindfulness practices, and circling practices. They literally get into a campfire circle after they've done the movement and the mindfulness practices. And so there's something here. I think the point you're making, Chris, and the point I'm making are very close to each other. There's something about moving, even physically, embodied moving in sympathy, and Tomasello's joint attention, right? The joint attention that seems to facilitate the pitching of something much more maybe exacted, but you know, something much more like virtue. Like we start nodding together, we start to move together. We talk about rhythm and music and all of these metaphors, and I noticed that in circling too. You do all this stuff to sort of get this moving in sympathy going, and so I'm just turning it back as a question now for the group. And you know, I obviously have ideas about embodied cognition and how what's happening in the body and what's happening in the mind are deeply resonant with. If there's something about this, like, so there's a threat here. Then there's a threat to Guy's world, because we can't literally walk together, and we don't actually have joint attention, and so I mean, there's a problem. There's a problematic here. If sympathetic movement is necessary for the catching of virtue, and it's very truncated in this medium, what things should we be doing to compensate for that?
Yeah. One of the things that comes to mind was this kind of way where, because it's been surprising for me that circling works in this way. And I realized I've even been resistant to it working. I didn't want it to work somehow, right? Because of my own probably biases and prejudice and all that kind of stuff. So it's actually really stretched me to understand, well, what's actually really going on some level. But I think one of the things that I like the way that actually, of all people, Steiner puts it, and when he talks about the senses, you know, you could say that on one level, the sense is an organ, but it's also a capacity, right? So like if I close my eyes and we're at a symphony and I say, okay, like pick out the sound of the trumpets, you're using your capacity to look, right? Even though you're using your ears to see it, you're not using your eyes, but you're looking in some sense with your ears, right? And picking that out of your attention. So I think that there's all these ways where actually, I think in conversation, there is so much movement going on, right? On so many different levels of senses that probably like go back and forth, that this sense of motion, I guess I feel a warning to one, not take it so literally, but also to see how deep motion and movement go. And of course, I'm thinking of Aristotle's whole reason for philosophy was his thing was like, how the hell can you be, and how can, if being doesn't change, how do you account for emotion or like for movement, right? So that's in the back of my mind too.
So there's probably some sort of connection between embodied motion and imaginal motion. There's something going on. The imagination is playing a very significant compensatory role here. That's what I was getting from you, Guy.
Yeah.
The imagination that, in addition to whatever physical movement we're doing and we're gesturing, a lot of us use a lot of gesture and intonation, a way we move up and down the scale of pitch and things like that. But it strikes me that there is a lot of imaginal motion going on here. The imagination, and I don't think I think it's more like there's two ways we think of imagination. There's imagination as inner imagery, and I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the imagination that's projected into the world, like when a pretense, like when a child pretends that a stick is a sword, right? And so it's imaginal. It's out in there in the world. It's actually shaping the way the world is disclosing itself to them, and they're disclosing themselves to the world. So I think what's happening often, this is a proposal, I should say, maybe it's a proposition too, is that we're also crafting often a joint imaginal thing. And then we're moving around it and through it. And the way I think that might be the case is because Jordan Hall has this almost synesthetic thing he does. We've all felt it because we've all touched with him, where we're talking and he suddenly has this image and it's out here between, and then he starts moving around it. And then it's often, it's a little bit shocking, but it's often very facilitatory. But I wonder if he's just got a gift for explicating something that's always happening implicitly between people. Sorry, that was just, I'm trying to, so you can tell it, this is really something, it's gotten into me and I'm really probing it. I really want to see into it.
Right. If I pull off of that, and again, it was in the midst of writing, but let me just, because I'll make it salient. So John, we and I talk about valence qualia, right? We stumbled upon that, okay?
Yeah.
And for me, really, that's the orientation of the body in the agent arena relation.
Yep.
Okay, it's like, and how is it going homeostatically? Okay.
Yeah.
So now that's basically then affect into embodiment. And I know Damasio talks basically about this. This is what feelings are. Okay. So, and then we pull that up and then we start simulating motion ourselves, simulating our behavioral investments in relation. And then we get to the Tomasello way of, well, now we're simulating and engaged our joint attention in our social world, right? Yeah. And then our relations are constantly moving as they're growing in terms of when we're doing our recursive relational relevance realization, right? It's like, hey, John, what do you think of me? And what do I think of Chris? And what do I think of Guy? And then what is this happening, right? And then as we do realization of, oh my gosh, can we steal the culture in a particular way? Can we imagine that? And can we realize that? And can we engage in fellowship and relationship to that? It just seems to embody many of the key thematics and, that sort of exemplify a dialogos.
That's cool. I'm wondering if there's some connection between, so yeah, that's great, Gregg. It's this dynamic thing, right? I don't know, like, I'm going to use a metaphor. It's a Platonic metaphor. There's this dynamic shape, right? Opening up, right? Imaginal shape. And I'm just wondering, this is just sort of, right? Is there some relationship between, jointly constructing that and participating in it and identifying with it, and then internalizing that in a way that informs us such that we start to become more virtuous?
Yes.
Here's where I think maybe you can maybe get that in a concrete way. What is it, and how is it easy to understand when people say, like, when they just listen to somebody else talk about their lives and they watch them go through something, like say in a circle or a therapy session or something like that, right? Where people often say, God, I wasn't even the center of attention, or that wasn't even me, but I feel like I learned so much through just listening to you. Right?
Totally.
Like, and what they're saying is I'm getting that they're pointing to so much is they're pointing to something beyond what can be like they could be informed by. And some level, they just went through something with them, right? They went through it with them, and they somehow found themselves in as if they were the person being talking about what they're talking about, going through that process. Because I have this kind of sense that in watching this over and over and over and over and over and over again, I think one of the reasons why it's so why is it so nourishing? People talk about coming to circling and just listening, right? They come out and they have these kind of this deep sense of being nourished, as if it's a nutrient that had been missing, but that they talk about it in terms of they learn so much, right? They gone through something with them, yet they were in some sense just listening. And I think that maybe points to what you're talking or what you're trying to get at, John.
I think so. That the nourishment and the fact of this, like there's a deep connection between, you know, being informed by the other people, being conformed to, I keep seeing sort of like a tetrahedron between a spinning tetrahedron between us, and internalizing that dynamic thing. And I see that in circling, but you know, Guy, you and I've been on this ongoing thing about there's circling, and then there's what you call circling 2.0, which is can we turn that? Can we take? And you mentioned earlier there's an affordance relationship between circling and dialogos, and I'm trying to get that the further affordance relationship between dialogos and virtue.
Right.
Because, and again, I think the same way you sort of internalize the dynamic of the other person's life as they're opening up and circling, right? And you sort of catch a way of being in the world that's very hard to specify and articulate in in a list of features. In dialogos, you can pick up something that allows you to catch virtue.
Let me use it. I'll use it.
Complex thing.
Let me use an example of what may be a sort of a microcosm of catching virtue, and then the reverse. Okay, so about 10% of couples, when they get married, about 10% end up having basically a true love kind of relationship. And what I mean by that is kind of Ronald Reagan, Nancy Reagan seem to have this kind of relation. Like you find your true other, you're completed, and then that's it. And those two people for the rest of their lives, you know, don't really consider any other option. Okay. And there's some good examples that this really does happen. 10%, 5%, but it's clear that it's a subset.
Low.
Okay. Well, obviously it's complicated, right? Because if we do individuation and all the shit that happens in the world, it isn't easy. Sometimes, right, you're completed, to use that, you complete me, and then there's a continuity of that. Okay. And I believe we have these templates where we're seeking to be known and valued in particular ways. And if there's a fortuitous matching of that with the other, and I feel known and valued and she feels known and valued, and then there's a fusion of that in a particular kind of way, okay? Then we can think about, well, what happens to the person in the couple, each individual and the couple, okay, is that they get to be their true selves at their heart, at their body, at their mind, and they get to get less and less filter. They get more and more authentic, and they get more and more then shared co-construction of each of themselves and feel seen. So they actually get sovereign individuation, and at the same time they get fusion. And then together you get this sort of idyllic relationship that's beautiful, that's good, that's true, that's robust, okay? And then creates a particular type of system that would then be very similar to the features that Aristotle would identify as sort of ultimate eudaimonic goodness, right? And if virtues cultivate into that, and then we can do the reverse, right? So people get together, hey, I love you, we all of a sudden, blah, 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 and then all of a sudden, wait a minute, who are you? And then my neurotic tendencies and her neurotic tendencies interact, and I can't believe that she would do this, and I injure her, and she injures me, and then all of a sudden there's a destructive force, right? That would then rip them apart, and people turn into contemptuous, irritant, defensive, neurotic individuals, and like, I don't even know you, or I don't know myself in relationship to this, right? And then you get almost the inverse of a eudaimonic state, and they end up in my office for couples therapy, right? And so you can see if that's a microcosm. And then we were saying, well, what would a societal system look like that would tend to cultivate, and not so much the marriage, but the philia, agape context that we would mutually engage in relational value and move the system toward some sort of eudaimonic polis or civium or whatever.
That's interesting, because then I think one of the problems or one of the challenges becomes, I mean, for the couple that have the time and the continuity to basically develop and to unfold in an evolving process, that relationship, that mutual knowing and mutual fittedness, right? The gnosis of one another, that's the foundation of what you've just described, Gregg, and the foundation of the practice that's trying to be cultivated here. It's such a beautiful model. It's a beautiful exemplar. But then the challenge is too that we have a context in which we have neither the time nor the resources nor the means nor the willingness really for people to develop reflectively opposite one another with the same degree of intensity. And yet we do have to find a way of scaling and somehow reproducing, even metonymically, even just a trace of what you've just described in order for, I think, something like Dialogos to actually be viable. And I think that's part of what you do, Guy, right? Encircling, as you establish these, they're fleeting and they're brief, but they're real for the duration, these real senses of mutual episteme of one another that last long enough to kindle something like a genuine Dialogos. But I think that's to me, like, that always strikes me as a real challenge, to this project, that how do we get people to be sufficiently knowing of one another to generate what must be generated without requiring 10 years of commitment in which they get to know each other gradually and incrementally. Yeah. And I know that sounds like a silly problem framing, but to me, it's like, it's a big one. It's one that I feel personally, it's a significant barrier, not an insuperable one necessarily, but a significant one.
I think it's a very significant barrier. I think it's very complicated for a whole host of different reasons. 90% of couples who have the opportunity to get to know one another, at least in the current arenas that we offer, find themselves, listen, I want to be myself in a particular way and you want to be yourself, and man, do we clash. And I start to wonder whether this is the best thing, right? And so that there are lots of good reasons why that's going to happen. And that will, to me, that's always the potentiality that has to be there, or else we would basically be locking people down into procedures and say, okay, well, you're now procedurally married to this person and you're done. You have no option. Okay. If we're going to give people the freedom to individuate and grow, they will potentially grow apart, right? And then their interests and capacities and everything else, they will not be known and valued by virtue of the deviation of growth. You're not always going to know and value grow together, because you can grow apart. I mean, in my marriage, for example, the mere fact that I fell into the unified theory, okay, and is weird, right? Then that changes me and makes me obsessed in a particular kind of way that my wife doesn't follow. And as a function of that, I grow in a particular direction that creates a significant distance that we then need to navigate. And that's inevitable. So there's going to be this tension and limitation, but there are structures in place that are either conducive to its opportunity to flourish, to plant seeds and to take root, or there are structures in place that are unbelievably conducive to making it extraordinarily difficult. Ideologies, practices, tendencies that put people right on edge. So when it goes bad, it decompensates. And something like circling then is about, in some ways, at the fellowship or whatever communitas level, it's like, well, what is the kind of arena that can create a town that maximizes the likelihood that people can grow, knowing that it's going to be tough to grow close and together.
So there's two things I'm hearing. I just want to just highlight that I'm hearing that are present. So one is there's the phenomena of the connection, right? The experience of being connected with one another, and those moments that where you could have it with somebody you've known for forever, and for some magical ways you can have it with somebody instantly sometimes, right? And then there's a relationship over time, right? That can be to various degrees like that moment of connection, right? But it's not exactly the same thing as that intermittent one. It has properties that afford it. Maybe it happens more often, or maybe it's more of a tone. And those two things are, I think, are distinct, right? They can happen with each other or not.
Sure.
The other thing that you said a little bit earlier, John, I just wanted to pick up on. You said you were talking about, like, yeah, there's something about you're doing where you're listening or grokking a way of being that's hard to put into words. You said something like that, right?
Yeah.
But do you remember what you were trying to get at there?
What I was trying to get at is there's a deep, at least it looks like, similarity between, there's something emerges between us. We, Chris and I call it Geist or the Logos, and it has a shape to it that's very, very hard to capture in propositional conceptual form. And this is a classic point. And then that seems to also be the case for virtue. Right, if I ask you, well, what is courage? And then you get the Platonic dialogue, and nobody comes up with a definition, because it turns out, oh, wow, right? What is it? What is it? But also there's another similarity in it. If I don't have some courage, if I can't exemplify it in the dialogue, I won't actually get anywhere in the dialogue, right? I have to, right? There has to be some courage there. It's part of your thing, Guy, about, we go somewhere and we discover that there was something already ahead of us, but that was always there with us.
Yeah.
Right. And that's also the case, right? That's also the case for what's going on here, right? That if there isn't some logos in us, we can't catch the logos. And so I'm seeing a deep connection between that, we shape together. I'm sorry, I'm using geometrical metaphors, but we shape together this space, and that's a common metaphor that people use. Even circling is a geometrical metaphor, right? We shape together this space, and then that space, right, is something that we catch because we're participating in it. There was something in us that was already in it, but there's something that's being drawn from us, and that's something like how we participate in virtue, but as we get these shapes, that virtue is shaped in us. It's drawn forth from us. It develops. And part of it, I think part of what's happening, I think part of what compensates for, the profound intimacy that sex can give you for the married couple, and there's the bodies moving together again, right? The sympathy. I think one of the things that's working here, and I've talked about this before, is we figure out a way to get individual flow and collective flow working together, so that individually we're in the flow state, and that's sort of part of our logos, but collectively we're in a flow state. It's sort of a holographic thing that's happening, and that to me seems to be essential. I don't think it's sufficient, so I shouldn't say essential. I think it's central to answering part of Chris's question. I think you can take people that are almost strangers, and if you get that flow, and you get, and then you also get within that everybody has come in at least with a joint attention towards aspiration, that can give us what we need in order for people to start to sense that they're transcending themselves, and that they're actually internalizing, or at least, better way of putting it, educing virtue. And part of it, I think, has to do with what you were saying, Guy. We get this deep, and you too, Gregg, part of what how virtue is in us is our call to, you said it really good, Gregg, with the married couple, like you get to authentically be, right? There's a sense in us, a normative sense that we can't articulate ahead of time, right? That we are moving towards a fullness of being. And somehow the flow, see, I'm running out of words, so I'm starting to gesture madly. Somehow it has to both be empowered by that sense and empower that sense.
Yeah.
Did that
It's
make
like relevance realization.
that make any sense at all?
No, I mean, actually, I'm kind of being funny, but
It
it's
does.
true, John, right? Right? I mean, it's like, I am vision, right? I then, I'm oriented to see what I can then realize to make happen. And then I don't know what it is before it happens, but I have an envision what I want when I come into this, right?
Yeah.
And then I'm carving it out, and then I'm making it as I both realize that it's the case. And now we're doing it recursively in relation. I don't know, to me, it was just sort of like, this is like another side of this cognitive embodiment process.
Yeah, and that's exactly right, Greg. And the degree to which it's enhancing that and orienting it towards eudaimonia is wisdom. That's part of what wisdom
Which is the ultimate virtue.
Let me see. Yeah,
I'm
go
getting all
ahead.
excited.
Let me
just
see
wanted
if
to
I'm
say-
getting how it's wise. Go ahead, John.
Well, I just wanted to say, I agree with all that. And Guy, I want you to ask your question because I think it's a pertinent one. But the question I'm coming to, see, that's the explanation, but I'm looking for the proleptic pedagogical thing.
So this is
what do we do? Yeah. What do we do?
Let me give it a shot.
Okay, please.
Let's talk about what happens, and then we can abstract out what we do. So all four of us have an agent in an arena, right? And I'm like, I come into I come into the conversation, all four of us. I have my agent arena. You have your agent arena. You're vaguely getting into my arena, right? Like, but you have a separate agent and arena. But then we start to converse, and then that thing, that logos things that Chris highlights, it's like where all of a sudden my speaking becomes my listening, and my listening becomes my speaking, and that inner penetration. I think at some point we start to have the experience of being the shared agent with the shared arena. But as that keeps going, then I turn towards you, and in one moment, like, I'm looking at the agent, right? And I'm the arena speaking, and then you become, right? You get this mutual penetration that goes back and forth. And I think that's the thing that maybe happens if we look at it like that. And that's why it's so conducive to flow states, right? Because you get that, and it's what seems to be a requirement is that sense in which my understanding of what you mean, John, by like a flow state is it's an agent or arena relationship where, as the agent, I do something, and in the arena both opens itself and points back to the agent. It allows the agent to be more of an agent in that arena, and it's this mutual opening up. It's got to have that sense on an interpersonal level, right? And you just keep doing that. That's my sense.
But there was a piece you just put in there.
Yeah.
There's a piece you just put in there that was brilliant. This idea, and I think it's exactly a way of, I think it's isomorphic to Chris's idea about the speaking and the listening, right? It is this idea that we're constantly flipping. That's the imaginal. We're constantly flipping between agent and arena for each other. I thought that was what you just did there, because, and Greg, think about like when we talk, insight, and when you're doing the reversals, the figure ground reversals, and how that really drives insight and flow. We're kind of doing figure ground reversals at the imaginal level between agent and arena. That's what I heard you saying, Guy. And that really powers the potential for this kind of interpersonal flow. Does that track with what you're saying?
Totally does.
I want to hear what Chris has to say.
The figure, John, as you're speaking, I'm thinking part of the figure ground reversal is actually an individuation participation figure ground reversal as well. Because there's like an aspect shift sometimes in the throes of the process. The company you're keeping is a being with yourself, and sometimes the company you're keeping is the being with others. But there's a way in which they become affined by the process, right? The multiplication, the multiplicity of the interpersonal interaction becomes identical to the intrapersonal or the intrapsychic multiplicity that's being agreed or accorded in the course of the process, right? So it's almost like if you were to shift aspect one way, the multiplicity would relate to the agreement of oneself. And if you shifted the aspect the other way, the multiplicity would relate to the agreement or the harmonization with others. But fundamentally, they're identical in process.
Right.
Do you think
that's exactly.
like, I've talked about virtue is the beauty of wisdom, where you're trying to get the optimal grip. Do you think that aspect shifting is also a central feature of virtue?
Well, yes,
Yeah.
I think so. Because here's, okay, so, all right, so there's a interesting book called The Altruistic Brain, okay? The Altruistic Brain basically argues that the way in which we engage in pro-social at a brain level is as follows. We have a self model, we have an other model.
Yeah.
And then when we engage in affiliation, what I would call affiliation, which basically means you blend with the other, okay? You actually represent the interest, the brain does a representation of interest of other, and then it brings them together and creates static, okay? Like in the brain signals, okay?
Right.
So now you can't actually like differentiate. I am the other, right? So now in terms of interest, and if we do figure ground positional relationing, okay, then we're actually then shifting back and forth about what's salient. If we do it well, we will preserve the integrity of the individual. So I've got me, and they have that, and then at the same time create a we space, okay? Create a we space. And if you hold the individual and model the other, both with integrity, individuation, and create a we space that actually, then it seems virtuous to me.
Yeah, that there's a deep connection between that virtuosity and virtue. This is really starting to sting for me. The idea that we're getting into the flow state, which is optimal. It enhances cognitive flexibility, insight. But what's really particular here is this aspect shifting, figure ground reversal between individuation and participation that's central to being virtuous. And if we can't initially do it, we'll never catch it. But if we already can do it a bit, this will catch. And this has the capacity to give us something fundamental to making us more virtuous, especially if that figure ground reversal is caught up, as we already talked about earlier, in the joint aspiration to wisdom.
Yeah. And it becomes somehow the future that calls the conversation itself. This is why I have a feeling that, I think why the God of the West, once it became affable, couldn't hold, right? God better be ineffable, otherwise we're fucked, right? But there's something about the ineffability, and that is also the case with virtue, right? Like this kind of way where you can't pin down virtue. It's always beyond, it's always kind of beyond, yet calling forward. It's got this kind of temporal dynamic to it. And this requirement that I keep thinking about vulnerability in order to penetrate. And is it like, in what way is it virtuous to allow myself to be penetrated by the process itself, already a virtue, right? Like the fact that I'm attracted to something that could also, because that's always the thing with vulnerability and personal intimacy. I think it's probably like, I would imagine it's the case in all kinds of intimacies, where it's like there is a moment where I'm taking a risk, right? I'm opening myself to something.
I wanted to drop this in because it got salient. My friend Mike Mascolo, who is really sort of invested in the interpersonal relational construction of reality in a particular way, in a foundational way. He wants to start with the intersubjective, okay? And his fundamental principle, the moral principle that what he can encapsulate is there's a fear for the self and a love for the other. Okay, that's the essence of like we are pro-social, we have an orientation to the other, but at the same time we got to protect the self at whatever level. And so to me, it's a very, very nice heuristic that then establishes the dialectical concerns that then get people, either in harmony or not. And so to me, what came to me, and this was slightly before you were saying, Guy, but I think when we get into God and what we're leaning towards, and there is virtuous cycles. That's what we call them in psychotherapy, vicious cycles, virtuous cycles, right? And the virtuous cycles of love would then be love of the other that then gets mirrored back to me. So now I am loved, and then creates a communitas of love in a particular kind of way. And that would then way in which you would catch virtue in that regard. And again, versus what? The vice of then getting threatened, becoming defensive, and then giving into sin in particular kinds of ways. You could see that feels like a polarity. I don't know if that's catching, but it feels like
Yeah.
It's helpful.
Mm.
It's helpful.
Well, there's that
I-
way. It reminds me of that way where it's even possible to start with this with the inner subjective in some sense as the ground of being, right? Because I think it's really close, right, all the way down, and that's precisely in Meitz's Zen, right? That being is being with, right? It's like, and one of the things I kind of got also from writing my paper is that like sociality, the presuppositions of a social world in a Cartesian way kind of presuppose that we have to be social, and that by virtue of that sociability, a social world is created. But it doesn't account for how is it that beings who aren't already social in some level create a social world? So it brings it back into this sense in which like this kind of sense in which I think is what Heidegger was really getting at, is that you can't separate those out, that in some ways from a certain focal setting, like in some way being itself is a being with, right? And you maybe from another level, you look at it and you maybe call it's an interconnection with all things, but from another level, it's the ground of its sociality as us. And in some way, a conversation is almost like a living symbol, right? That we enact that ground in some way. And then you get to have all these cosmoses, because it is really these I find these conversations are like little cosmoses that I go into and I come out and I'm like, I was just cosmosed.
It's a good point though, Guy. And I mean, if we take a look at think of the triune God, right? The God that is three persons, just to bring that in for a second, just as an example of what you're talking about, right? There is an intersociality implicit in that theological model. The being itself in that case is a kind of being with, and each person is, if I understand the theology right, it's each person. Probably don't, but I'll pretend that I do for a moment.
I'm not laughing at you, Chris. I'm laughing with you.
It's okay. I'm laughing at me. That each of the three persons somehow is singly what the three persons are collectively.
Yeah.
And there's something very much like that paradox operating within the dialogic space, right? In that same fractal sense. So it's no wonder that even at that level of intelligibility, there's an implicit sociality at play in the process of according the oneness. The oneness has to be accorded within a plurality of sorts. And it's about the harmony and the plurality that actually constitutes the singular.
Yeah.
I mean, the Heideggerian point is, right, that the way it's the critique of the Cartesian point is, I only become myself through others.
Yeah.
I can't. And this is all through Plato. The other is the mirror by which I ultimately get self-knowledge.
Yep.
There is no way. There is no Cartesian monadic way in which we are a self. That's the bullshit of individualism, which is very different from individuation, right? Right. So and Chris and I have been working on that self transcendence is through the other. I can only other myself. I need to other myself in order to rise above myself, right? And I can only other myself through the other. And so I think they're deeply bound together. And then I think, God is pointing to that, the Trinity. And of course, the Neoplatonists had a Trinity too. Trinities show up. The Hindus have a Trinity too, right? They keep showing up, right? And Jung is very happy about that, I suppose. Right. But the thing is, right? The reason I laughed is the Trinity is both the profundity of the sociality, the interbeing, the interselfing, right? And also the permanent withdrawal of that. Not in the sense of it disconnects from us, but and here I'm going to get a little bit prosaic and concrete. Like if I'm in a flow situation and I start to master the environment, I drop out of flow. I drop out of flow like that. If I can master God, right, and master the self, right? So you see, that's what I'm trying to pick up on Guy's point and Chris's point, and I'm drawing them together. You know, the intersociality also has to have an aspect of it that always recedes from us. But it's not a withdrawal of neglect. It is a withdrawal that opens up a space of demand. I almost hear it like, follow me. You know, this is you see this in Jesus, right? His weird request to follow me. And it's like, what does that mean? At one level, it means just walk around with him, the shared movement. But another thing means it's, I'm going to keep receding, but my receding is not an abandoning of you. It is an affordance of you to keep, it's a demand on you, a calling to you to keep going beyond and on and on and on and on and on and on. Disciple means to follow, right? Discipline means to follow.
Is that why, as it's happening right now, is the very thing that you're talking about, as it's happening right now, you want to talk faster because of that? Yeah. I'm trying to follow the logos. I'm being disciplined by the logos. I'm a disciple of the logos. Yes,
it is withdrawing, but it's not the withdrawing of abandonment. It's the withdrawing that is constantly calling me beyond myself.
Right. That's beautiful, because when I heard, it was over the summer, I heard, hey, be a good ancestor. Okay. And that hit me deeply, you know, and I've sort of been like, I've been like now, like that's a real, I was like, live your best life and be a good ancestor really feels like, you know, I find myself, and I've said that to people in clinical context now and things like that. And what you just said, John, just resonated with a level of clarity of, that's what that thing holding out there as it recedes, but not abandoned. It pulls me forth in dynamic participation, because God only knows what it looks like, right? There's no way to master that. There's no way, in the sense that you can, right? You know, so it sits in dynamic becoming in relation to me in a way that then resonates in a really interesting way. So the way you captured that, it gave me real insight into, that's why that thing's resonating with me, at least. That's why it's sitting with me very interestingly.
But that's it. I mean, there's, and I hesitate to use this word because it's got these weird associations. So I'm emphasizing the disciple part. We're all disciplining each other. It sounds like we're punishing each other, but I'm trying to get is this kind of disciplining of each other. And that's again bound up with catching virtue from each other.
And there's also here comes in that kind of sense, the sociality sense, right? What's always there, right? Is embarrassment and horror is like just a second away, right? Like if I say something that's like a little off key or a little bit up, and like just one of you just needs to look at me weird, and all of a sudden I'm self-conscious, and then we're all self-conscious, and like maybe it's even happening now, who knows, right? But there is that sense of that's one of the things that fades in the background, is that seems farther away, right? And in some sense, I think it is. But I think there's that, you brought in that parenting part, right? Which is so, and I think I'm going to call on Gregg around this one. This is where maybe we start to get into the self-justification, because the necessity of shame for sociality, right? Like, I mean, shame is, at beyond the affect level is like, gets pretty problematic, right? But like shame in terms of, if we didn't have shame, no one would stay in line. We couldn't have any order, right? So there's just, I want to bring in that element of that, and I think that what I kind of got out of your video that I mentioned, John, about where the part of the fount of intelligibility seems to have a lot to do with this very sociality, that there's a way that the culture and a relationship can be a like a symbol, like a literal symbol of where it brings, it doesn't seek to master the ineffable. It in some sense follows it, right, and transcends itself, but that it's possible to do that in relationality, right? And that also can have this way where it also shapes order that in some sense stands still as a culture. Because this is one of the things about it that I think that we're inside of, is that I notice that like spiritual, like a lot of the non-dual spirituality right now puts so much emphasis on the state that you're in, right? The state of awakening, right? And I think that may be actually, like, in some sense, a compensation for that. None of our architecture will hold any of it, right? Like like the streets and the way that they're set up, where it's like if you were, when Christian had its dominance, everything about the town was holding the cross at the top of it. And so you didn't even have to be conscious of it, let alone to be enacting it. So there's this kind of place where our architecture, we're in between times of intelligibility or something. The fall of the West is happening. Who knows, however you want to put it. But we are in a place, right, where there's not a whole lot that stands still that holds it. But there's also a way that what we're talking about is inevitable, but it's also structural formation, right?
Yeah. It's logos. I mean, it's structural function. It's dynamical, structural, functional organization of intelligibility, right?
Amen. And we can do a lot better in intelligibility. I'll give an example around shame. Okay, so shame is one of the most important things in the clinic room, right? And our society has no idea how to deal with shame. Okay,
good point.
We don't have any idea. And it's not nearly, in my estimation, it's not nearly as complicated as we make it. Okay, like what we ought to understand is that we engage in vertical relations, like above and below. Okay, and we're afraid of being below, especially if we were forced. And when we're forced based on our own competence or our own humiliation, we get into the cluster that is shame and is embarrassment and is humiliation in the negative sense. Okay, of all of that. And then the question is, well, what is that, and how do we metabolize that as a group? Okay, and my experience is people have no idea how to metabolize that. Okay, in other words, what do I mean metabolize? There's a self model and a self narrator and a relational world that how is that put onto a stage and then understood, broken apart, and learned from productively, or not? Okay. And what I see an enormous amount of is, oh my God, we could never shame anybody. So no stigma, no one should ever feel shame. Shame's a horrible thing, which would be like, that's got its problems, right? And then other individuals are like, have no idea to metabolize and experience so much fear and isolation, don't know what it's like to be known and valued. And then they turn against the self. And then shame then collapses into a core self-evaluation of my personhood, my being, my essence is worthless, is foundationally inferior. Okay. So that both of those are disastrous. All right. They're both disastrous. And we walk with both of them. The issue with shame, as I tell my kids, is, hey, it's situational. Okay. You know, and if somebody forced you into shame, I want to protect you from that. But if you F up and do something embarrassing and feel like, oh my God, I didn't study for this test and I want to do well, but I didn't. Don't say, I pretend it didn't happen. Don't say the teacher did a bad thing. You screwed up and you feel bad. That's okay situationally, right? Yeah. You can situationally feel bad and then metabolize your growth capacity to learn from that situationally. If I'm talking to my kids, I will love you. I would die for you. I will protect you. Whatever you did on the test, foundationally, you are held, but situationally, you screw up. So
Gregg,
situational shame.
Is it fair to say that, like, in some level, like, shame at that level is actually the revelation of the situation or the structure of the situation that you just hit? It's the place where it bounces back, and shame is like the way that it reveals itself in some way.
Yes, it's a relational recursive relevance realization. If it's held in love, it's like, oh, that's what it is. And then basically you get hit by it, and then you figure out how to learn from it. What sets you up to make you vulnerable to that screw up? And then what can you learn about yourself and your history and relation so that daily you can grow? And then if you're circled around a secure base where people are never going to undermine your fundamental value of respect, you can hold that, metabolize it, and grow from it. And so many people live their lives having no idea how to do that and aren't given circles of relations that allow them to do that with health.
That's a really good point, Gregg. And it's interesting because it's most people, it's just that we don't see, we're so ill-equipped to see ourselves as dynamical relations in motion. We're so ill-equipped to see ourselves verbally. And I think one of the things that implodes people and combusts their sense of definition is if a particular agent-arena relation is mistaken for the totality of the self that emerges from it.
That
Yeah,
is so
well
big.
said.
There it is.
Well said. Well said.
Yep.
Idolatry. That's a kind of idolatry.
It is. You
Yeah.
got it, John. Yeah, exactly. It's idolatry.
And if that's a possibility, once that becomes a known possibility or a feared possibility in some way, that changes the game.
Yep.
Forever, right?
All of this.
On some
Right.
level, right?
Yep. Nope. It creates a very brittle psyche, actually, what it does,
Yeah.
you know, because then you get hit,
Yeah.
then you fear it, then you think
Yeah.
it's real because you reify it, and then you have to defend against it to show
Yeah.
others that you're not that or pretend you're
Yeah.
not that, and then you're disintegrated and incoherent
Right.
because you are afraid what you are, what you are, and then the whole thing is just basically a shell game of different states that are competing against each other, and it's a nightmare.
I'm hearing
Yeah.
John's intuition about questioning narrative, right, in its place, right, as foundational. I'm hearing that in all of this, right. I'm also hearing this in what you're talking about, Chris. I think you said the herd self or the listen. What did you say? Something you emphasize herd. I think you said the herd self instead of the seen self.
Listen to yourself. I think something like that.
Because there is
Yeah.
something
I think
about
yeah.
I mean, who is it? Walter. I just read Walter Ong's book again, Orality in Literature, where you just really get the transformation that happened between primarily oral culture and a literate one. It's not just the addition of this other convenience. It's a metamorphosis on some
It's
level,
a total
right?
change.
But in some sense,
Psychotechnology
in some
always-
sense, what and I can feel this intuitively. In some sense, what maybe we're grasping or what's calling to us is returning something of the self that was from oral culture, and sustaining it through like the concretizations of that could come through like visual metaphors, if you will, right? The dynamics, because it used to be, in fact, I think this is what he was saying. If you take somebody who's illiterate and ask them about themselves, their capacity, they can't really abstract themselves out, talk about themselves without putting themselves within a situation, right?
Yes.
It
Yes,
takes
yes.
something in orality, like what in alphabetic reading, which is a historical, like that we accomplish that is just absolutely stunning. Like that most of the people can read is just absolutely unlikely, right?
Well, none of this would have been here. None of this technology would have emerged.
Yep. No, it's a
Absolutely.
total-
You can't get the power of distributed cognition
Yeah.
without that technology.
Yep. Yep.
And the
But
problem
I think
is,
your point
and here's
about
the framing, the part, I think that there's something that can't survive that frame that I think that we still hear, right?
Mhm.
And I think it
Of
is,
course.
I'm hearing it in that sense of the herd self, like the listening metaphors, the interpenetration that comes so easily, the evanescent of sound, the here goneness of sound, right? The distance and immediacy sense of things, the sense of movement, right? Is, I don't know. I'm just hearing some of that.
This is really interesting. So as you're talking, Guy, so John, you'll often say, that this medium, the medium that we're dialoguing through right now, is somehow a symbolon, and that it's conjoining.
The public and the private are joined in a really new and weird way.
Right.
Agreed.
So the public and the private are conjoined, but then hearing Guy talk about oral culture, I never thought of it in this way before, because you're right, John. I mean, literacy is a necessary condition for distributed cognition, but is this somehow an affordance for a new kind of conjunction between distributed cognition and oral culture?
That's exactly what it is.
Yeah,
In
because
my
I've
opinion.
seen
Brilliant.
another way it's a symbolon. It's a symbolon in that it's a symbolon, the two things that Socrates pits against each other, the living speech and the dead writing. This is a symbolon that joins them back together again. Because
Exactly.
we've got the living speech, but it's preserved. And then it enters into what Jordan calls the meta conversation, the meta dialogue that's out there.
Yeah.
And see,
Well, it's
and what's
remembering something. It's like the symbolon is
Totally.
actually a source of remembrance. It's becoming a source of anamnesis then, because it's rejoining or reuniting things that were formerly disparate. And there's no wonder that a renewed I don't know, a renewed orientation to the sacred could be a consequence of the reunion of those two axes.
I think that's super. I think it's really true, and I had that thought, but now I'm getting a slightly different angle. I'll bring in. So I like the idea of dividing up cultural sensibility into oral, traditional, like Bronze Age into Axial Age, modern and postmodern. Okay, those have certain kinds of sensibility, and then the meta modern at some level represents a capacity to appreciate the value and structure and heritage and emphases of each of those in an integrated pluralistic fashion, right? And what more than any other, in my opinion, are we in desperate need to remember is oral, both in terms of the relationship, in terms of our embodiment with nature, in terms of our hubris, in terms of our focus that modernity gave us to have people like Donald Trump or whatever in relationship to the ego. You know, the oral traditions are completely wise in relationship to managing the ego while giving sovereignty to the individual and community. That's one of the things they do beautifully, right? So one of the potentials here in the symbolon, right, is maybe we will remember some of the wisdom of that way of being through enhanced orality that's afforded by the medium.
What
I think that's
mnemonic,
right.
powerful kind of meta-mnemonic capacity.
So we, to my mind, we're doing something deeply analogous to what Plato's doing with the dialogues. He's trying. I mean, we're not there with Socrates, but Socrates is talking about, right. So what he was trying to do, and that was who wrote that book? Starts with an R. Heidegger's Plato.
Rakowski.
Rakowski. He was trying to talk about. He gave that really, really powerful argument that the dialogue form is not an ornamentation or just an artistic choice. It's an essential necessity for the Platonic project of trying to link the dynamic orality of speech with the reflective rationality of writing. And putting those two together is, this medium, and that might be, there's a special role there for this medium in helping us to catch virtue. The thing that Guy was alluding to, a whole bunch of other conversations I've been having in the meta dialogue space with people like Mary Cohen and Paul Van der Klee. We had a couple videos and other people. Well, anyways, I've been sort of wrestling with. I keep starting with. I totally acknowledge, and I've argued for, and giving you a theoretical explanation for why narrative is essential to being a temporally extended moral agent. Totally. But that doesn't seem to be enough. They know it's narrative all the way down into the atoms of the universe. And I was trying to think about, and I was trying to say, but we don't start narrative. We don't start with a capacity for narrative. Mary caught me in a good mistake. I was conflating dialogue and dialogos. We start in dialogue. Tomasello, all the turn taking, joint attention, and then that makes language acquisition possible, and then that makes narrative possible, right? And then we carry dialogue into narrative, and dialogue within narrative makes the drama, makes dialectic possible, which makes dialogos possible. And that's actually a continuum, a developmental continuum that Paul proposed. And so I thought, wow, that's convergent. I get that. But nevertheless, there's been this, and I'm trying to be, I'm sorry, I don't want to be sneaky here. These people they're talking with me in good faith, but that they weren't satisfied with that. I was trying to get at, like, what is it? Like, what is it that they want? And I don't have an answer, but I think your intuition, Guy, is right. I'm trying to point to something. I'm trying to point to that being the protagonist within a narrative is dependent on being a participant within dialogue. That intersociality that we were talking about is the foundation for being a protagonist in a narrative.
Can you say that
And-
one more
and it's
time?
also,
Being a
pardon me?
protagonist, say it again, being a
I'm saying
protagonist in
being a
that.
participant, yeah, being a participant in, right, in the intersociality,
Yeah.
right, the
Yeah.
intersubjective intersociality, right,
Right.
is the affordance, the grounding affordance
Yeah.
for being the protagonist
Yeah.
in a narrative. And it's also the grounding affordance, like in the parabolic, of going beyond the narrative
Yeah.
towards the no thingness, towards that which is always withdrawing, but calling us forth in discipline and discipleship and in fellowship. That to me seems, and Guy, sorry, Greg, you'll support me on this. I mean, you know, you're reading Damicello. That's what the psychology says. And yet,
Yeah, no, there'll be lots to, so from, anyway, that won't start get us into a theoretical conversation about the nature of knowing, but.
but so we'll put that aside, but, and you know, so I thought I still carry with me a perplexity, and maybe it's my stupidity, but you know, you guys are really smart and
Well, that
wise.
would be perplexing if it was.
There's a hunger there. There's a hunger there that I'm not getting and I'm not properly respecting.
And I want to get to just your eyes, what you're experiencing. The hunger is for narrative to be
The
somehow
hunger is
all
not
the way
just
down.
for narrative. No. This is how I put it, and Paul nodded in agreement. There's a hunger for the exclusivity of narrative.
Yes, yeah. I can actually get this. If you want me to bring me into the conversation, I did listen to a couple of them. I know what they're saying. Okay, at least I can hear what they're saying. And there is narrative. Well, again, we can decide, John, about how much to talk about this, because then there's an enormous amount of detail. But to me, at least where I sit on justification systems theory, I mean, this is all worked out. I mean, you know.
Well, I believe you, so help me.
You know, because what happens is propositional knowing gets the anchor, and then pragmatically the personal, social, analytic is all tangled together in a social pragmatic where I'm navigating my private, I'm navigating the public, and we are navigating the we space. And the way in which we coordinate is around narrative, and legitimize is an ought is narrative-like in the oral. I mean, virtually all of our stuff is narrative, okay?
Right.
In terms of their justificatory narrative in relation that has propositional bricks that then are woven together in a particular kind of structure that is proper to then delineate, yes, narrative is different than, say, analytic, and then parabolic is a particular kind of abstraction that takes off of narrative that creates a particular kind of abstract archetypal symbolic message that creates a moral in relationship to the story. But those are not identifiable categories of knowing in any way near the pristine way in which we can do the other four.
Yeah. I've been trying to make that argument too. So thank you for that. But and that's a genuine thank you. So I heard something in there that might be helpful. Is the commitment, the hunger for the exclusivity of narrative, is it, I want to say pretense, but I don't mean in deception. I almost mean in like when you're pretending, right? Is it the pretense that I'm a moral agent all the way down? Is it the person trying to deny that they're also the primate? Is your language, Greg?
Well, I think that's an issue. I don't know if it's the issue, but it's certainly an issue.
That was too strong on my part. I formed it. Sorry, it was a misleading question. Is it something that could be going on as one factor? Yeah.
I'd be offended
100%.
if some people didn't see my monkeyhood. I thought it was obvious.
I mean,
I get what you're saying, though.
especially modernists. Okay, I mean traditionalists and the modernists. The oral indigenous animated embodiment of holism and animism is less that way. But when we became civilized, the personhood above nature justificatory narrative became central to the entire game of justification, and that is embedded across many, many different domains.
That's helpful.
It's also just, there's something about, like, I'm hearing at the edges of this. It's just interesting. I'm hearing, like, I'm just hearing the edges of this. I don't even know if what I'm hearing exactly, but just this sense of the sense of what you're onto with narrative, John, right? And this sense of like how the self, like it becomes very clear that the self that arises, in some sense, the selves that are occur through the dialogues, right, are in some sense effervescent. They're beyond themselves, right? But that's good, right? And that there's something about the narrative structure that seems to be inherently cloggy to that. And here's one of the things I just want to bring on, right, into this and just see where this fits. You know, it's interesting when you think about the oral mind. I think is one of the things I really appreciated about this is like, to the holy oral mind, right? Imagine how defensive that mind would need to be to novelty, right? Where narrative and rhythm and rhyme, right, and a lot of the components of narrative are the very thing that carry the culture from one time to another, and the inner necessity of that, right, and the practices of that, and that narrative is as much structure holding and serves as a kind of text, right, in a certain way, that then when text comes along, all of a sudden there's a sense in which words have a thing like nature, which is very illusionary, but like you can kind of get it, where now we can outsource all that onto text, and now the mind is able to be open to novelty, right, in profoundly new ways, right? But I just kind of getting that there is a hearkening back to, I think that I still, you know, our brains are very much probably still just genetically adapted to not having text, right, but adapted to narrative structures, and it just seems like inherent. Chris, what are you getting?
Yeah, it's really
noticing your
interesting. This idea, yeah. This idea that the indispensability, because you're talking about the indispensability of narrative for the structure and configuration of intelligibility. So you could almost take it in the direction of a Kantian argument if you really wanted to take that far, right? And so there's a real
Kant spelled with the C.
Yeah, there's a pragmatic inflection to what you're talking about, though, Guy, right? Because there is a justifiable fear in losing the plot, right? If narrative is indispensable to the structure of intelligibility, and the proposal is to stray from it or to understand it as something that's not quite as essential as it appears, that's that there's a lot of that's a you know, there be dragons, I suppose.
But the opposite.
And so I want to presume upon the motivations of the people who aren't part of this conversation. I don't know. I don't know what's motivating the commitment to narrative, other than the fact that because it seems to structure the presentation of the world, it is something that we that we undermine at great risk. Not unnecessary risk. Perhaps the risk is very, very necessary. That's why so much of narrative in the parabolic sense is self-undermining, purposefully self-undermining. And so to me, it's like there's very legitimate danger in the subversion of the narrative form, but at the same time, there's also something necessary about it that's implicit to its form in the first instance. I find it difficult to separate narrative, the indispensability of narrative, from the indispensability of its subversion, its artful subversion in the service of, in the parabolic sense. To me, they're not. To me, there's no dissonance there. To me, that's all part of the same form. The form contains within it its own annihilation, just as poetry strives to annihilate itself in the service of the ineffable. So anyway, I don't know where that's going.
Here's also the case where it's actually now it can be unannihilatable, right? Just look at the ways you represent, like everything's recorded, right? This sense in which text can actually be captured, right? And then maybe there's a sense in which it, we say that we don't have to transmit orally anymore, but has text done a good job? I don't know if that's a real good analogy there. So I'm just seeing a lot of these threads kind of come together. So go ahead, John.
Well, I don't know how to reply to that point, guys. I was going to reply Chris's point.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think well, Chris, you and I are working on this. That narrative always needs to contain within it sort of the seeds of its own self-destruction, and there's similar things. And I've been sort of noticing, and this has been coming to me, that there's these family of practices we do in which we try to subvert propositional forms in order to enhance the procedural, the perspectival, the participatory. So you have mindfulness practices, you have koan practices, you have parables, and even at the core of the symbol, right? What we do, because it's people make this claim, and I sort of get it, but when I've published work on it, trying to find the difference between the metaphorical and the literal is famously hard. And then Nietzsche just gave up and said there is no difference. I think that's a little bit problematic, because there seems to be this feature about symbols that they involve this non-logical identity, this symbolon. And so when you state them, and there was even experiments about this, when you state them as statements, they look like inherent contradictions or category violations. And I don't think that's happenstance, that's the one common feature you're finding throughout them all, because what that does is it puts the propositional, it activates the propositional, and then makes it subvert itself so that it has to resituate itself in the other kinds of knowing. And I think that's an inherently valuable thing to say. But what I'm trying to say is, you guys have said we have to go before text, before orality. We have to go farther back. Before orality, there are all the non-speaking animals that have intelligence and cognition, right? And that's what I worry about with this attachment to narrative.
Yeah.
Like we're setting ourselves up like as discontinuous from the rest of the intelligent beings on this planet.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very, very risky thing to be doing, especially in the current state.
And it seems only narrative can do that.
Well,
the
thing that worries me as a cognitive scientist, a cognitive psychologist, is the deep connection between the autobiography and the end of history illusion. People think that they are an autobiography. They think that they are their autobiography, which is that's a ridiculous claim in a lot of ways, because of the way memory is so reconstructive, and the way where you can see that ridiculousness is in the end of history, right, bias. So if you ask people, have you changed a lot in the last 10 years? They'll say, "Oh, yes, I've changed a lot." Are you going to change a lot in the next 10 years? No. You ask them 10 years again, have you changed a lot in the last 10 years? Yeah. Are you going to change a lot in the next 10 years? No. You see the illusion. There's obvious reification going on there. And it feels to me, I'm sorry, this is just intuitive. It feels to me like a really implicit way in which the Cartesian monadic mind, I'm self-contained, I'm self-sufficient, I'm self-sustaining, is trying to still reassert itself. And that's sort of my concern. Now, maybe, tell me honestly, does that sound overblown? Because there's something in there. It's like, right?
Well, let me see if
go ahead, please.
Okay, so for me, the there is continuity, primates, and there is then a recursive discontinuity that emerges, right?
Totally.
Which the joint point of us as primates that then hooks and creates a complexity building feedback loop can be described as the justificatory narrative processes. I would be okay with that.
Yeah.
Okay. And what I mean by adding the narrative processes, I don't necessarily mean by stories per se, or certainly parables, I don't mean, but I do mean I'm going to navigate. You and I are on the planes, we're moving around, and we're going to tell stories about what the hell we're doing, about what we are, what we ought to be. And then we're going to build narratives, collective identities of the tribe. And there will be a drive. The more capacity we have for questions and counterfactual will create our need for the liminal space, which ultimately gives rise to me, the cave paintings and everything else is sort of like, okay, we got to then tell a story, some sort of sense-making story about what the hell's going on. And that sense-making story is a justificatory narrative of the world, of myself, in relation across development. And that essentially is then human culture. That's a linguistic embodiment of human culture, which is then it has also all the practices and technologies and embeddedness in ecology. But so it's a justificatory narrative process that does turn us from primates to persons over the last 100,000 years. So that's one way of saying it. I don't know whether that would resonate with them or whether they'd be excited or not excited about that, but that's certainly the way I would see it.
There's something here, John, where I'm kind of just sensing, like, I just want to put it, I don't know, to answer your question, if you're just being whatever, if you're overly concerned about this, but I do think that there's what people are hungry. I hear a hunger for non-verbal contact, like non-verbal relationship, non-verbal embodied sense. Like I can't tell you how many times I've heard it's like, stop, like, I don't want to hear your story. I want to get to know you. This kind of distinction in which someone's story is like a repetitive thing, right?
Coming up in practices. Don't tell me your story. Get below the communication is the communing. Right. And that's what and also the opposite, right? The way people get locked into narratives. That's what I was trying to do with the autobiography End of History. Right. People are doing that not only individually, but collectively. They get locked into narratives. And so this is a question I keep asking people, and it's almost like a Socratic question. There has to be something that allows us to acquire narratives and move between narratives and realize we're trapped in a narrative that is not itself narrative.
Yeah.
Okay, that's wisdom energy, by the way, to me.
Well, yes, exactly. Exactly.
What is it that can notice? Yeah.
Exactly.
And I think maybe whatever that is, maybe.
Actually, let me just pause that for a second. Can I just pause that for a second, John? Because to me, what you just articulated is the transition of the modern mind, which is trying to down like paradigmatic narratives and then live by them in a particular way, and the kind of way of being to transcend them, and in some ways recover also the base.
Yes. The deep continuity. Right? So, re-exact the primate back into the person in a new way so that we can recover the communing, so that we can communicate in new ways, and we can see outside of the spaces we've built with our communication. That's what I'm trying to recover.
Right. And to make space, to confer space back into the narrative form that allows it to articulate its capacity to graduate to just as different forms of discourse do, right? Like, John, we were working on this, right? Stratifying the different forms of discourse. Debate, even though they share obvious properties and they share a certain aesthetic and they share, right? That there's a lot of, they're homophonous in some ways, but the fact is that debate is not ontologically the same as dialogue and dialogos. And I think we can apply the same kind of stratification to narrative as a form and articulate it out and understand its capacity on a graduating scale, on a complexifying scale in much the same way. That doesn't require us to set it aside entirely, but also doesn't give it a kind of undue idolatrous.
I'll give you an example I had, and I'm not going to throw my dad under the bus, but I have my Oedipal issues. I love him. And he's Dad, I love you out there. But I was having a conversation when I had this exchange, and then my friend had this, he gave me this really nice narrative of his exchange and embodied wisdom of somebody from an oral tradition, an indigenous shaman scholar. And I was then telling my dad about, the convergences that he had, and I'd be skeptical of that. Okay, so my dad's a professor, but just the initial. And I was just sitting there, I was like, oh my God, he's just trapped in the modernist, rational, enlightenment kind of just way of thinking that is actually defined against all these other justificatory narratives, like at its face. It's like, I'm not going to enter into that. I have my religion, which is in his case, individual democratic reason in a classic liberal sense. It's like, but so it's like, just the inability to transition and drop into the empathy across scale, across the human scale, across the justificatory scale in a particular kind of way. Sorry if that was overly projective of Dad, but there it is.
No, that was good, Greg. To bring it back around to the religious domain, I like this is like Christmas really opened up for me. I read a book by Cynthia Peugeot called The Wisdom Jesus, and so this was materially the most impoverished Christmas I ever had, and it was one of the most beautiful Christmases because and my son and I, we watched Jesus of Nazareth together, and he got really interested in parables, and so all of this was happening, and I was talking with Chris, but what keeps coming back to me, it's the slogan for all of this is right. The other book in the Bible that begins with "in the beginning," and it's making us reframe the first one. Genesis is in the beginning, and the other book that begins with "in the beginning" is John.
John. Yep.
In the beginning was the logos. Not in the beginning was the mythos. And that's supposed to be deeply profound, and it's supposed to make us go back and think, even that thing back there, where you got the story of creation, go before that, go deeper than that. That's what's been calling me and calling me again and again. And then this idea that Socrates has where he says,
yes.
Pardon me?
Yes. I'm just getting, keep going.
Beautifully said, John.
And that resonates with me in this thing. I'm reading this amazing book, The Way of the Platonic Socrates, right? And he talks about how Socrates continually makes himself a space to follow the logos wherever it's going to go. And he's making the point that that's the opposite of a narrative. The narrative is you tell backwards so you can recover what you've learned, right? But the logos is carrying you into the unknown in a powerful way.
And it's even in a sense like when Heidegger would probably say something like, rather than listening as a series of propositions so that we can follow the movement of showing. It's interesting, like I've always thought about that sense of what are we following? Well, what's a showing when it's inherently unattached from the thing that shows, right? It's just the showing. That starts to sound a lot like sound, right? A way to listen. And I'm hearing you say, here, it's calling to me. The before, go deeper than that, is calling to me, right? So I'm hearing this sense of listening, right? So there's something that and we're kind of in this conversation, we're ending up in these dichotomies or dialectic between like visual, auditory, sight, and sound, and then this interpenetration of things. And now I'm starting to understand, like, oh, so is part of what's happening is this like major dialectic that's going on between oral and literate. That there is a conversation where they're coming. Are we inside of another dialectic that's working itself out? That we're kind of in some sense responding to, and we're just maybe bringing it to language right now.
I think there's three, Guy. I don't think it's just oral and literate. I think it's oral and literate and
that thing that's undisclosed to us as of yet because we haven't heard it back. That third thing. What's the third thing?
It's the third thing is underneath orality is the fact that we are biological, intelligent beings who have to fit to the world in very dynamical, living ways, and we have to be able to commune with ourselves and each other and the world before we're capable of orality.
Right.
If the mother and the kid don't have all of that machinery, so that try getting an animal to look at when you point and you joint attention. Try it. We have all of this machinery before orality that puts us into dialogue so that we can become oral beings.
Yes,
absolutely.
Yes, right. And are you saying, John, that in some sense I'm hearing it, that you want, like, in some sense, you're calling to have that be the case, not just in the temporal sense, but in the ontological sense, that it's always before, right?
Exactly. There's a symbolon within.
It's the origin that's present.
Yes, there's a symbolon within us between the literate, the oral, and I don't know what to call this, the communing.
The heart or whatever.
but right?
What is it? Let's stick with that for a second, because I think like one of the beautiful things of my last conversation with you, Gregg, was us talking about this experience that you had, where it's like almost like your whole thing synthesized into this feeling
the
in your
wisdom energy.
chest, right?
That's exactly right.
And the thing
Yep.
you're pointing to,
It's a vertical sort of coherence down into the cell. I mean, through there definitely drops, and with the linkage that I've got now with nervous system and pleasure, pain, really just feelings. I'll use Damasio's term, sort of the base of what I now call the base of sentience that are organized by valence qualia. My head can have the logos, or at least that kind of logos narrative, down into it. And yet it's the embodiment of being that really fundamentally is the return to the ground, and ultimately it dropped me all the way to energy, like the Big Bang. There's an element of that, all the way down, and that that opening and reciprocal opening, and then at the top down and bottom up, that's a beautiful thing.
And you said a few minutes earlier that wisdom energy, notice the terms, wisdom energy, right? It's like, right, that's the power that allows us to acquire narratives, move out of narratives, move between narratives, realize that narratives are misleading us. And that's something, there's something in there about in the beginning was the logos. That
what is,
I mean, I'm not really religious, but I was definitely, when I saw that John, like the gospel, and because I saw it in Jordan Peterson captured that in one of his series and made it salient to me. And I'm coming off of sort of, my first phase tree of knowledge, and then this garden thing, and a return to paradise. Then sort of it's this full loop, it's sort of like, I'm going to pull out, we're going to have justifying self-consciousness, and then we're going to organize that. We're going to understand the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and then we're going to return back into being ultimately. At least that's the arc of the symbolism in my story.
Good. That's good.
So I'm getting this sense now of this sense of like, okay, when in dialogos and in circling and in this process of relationship I'm getting this sense of like circling around origin, right? If the conversation, right, is conversing about what's conversing us, right? What we're starting to get into, we start to converse that which was historically behind us, but ontologically always prior to us, right? That seems to be something like there's a restoration, like you could say, I don't know, would this be at the level of like Heidegger's notion of the history of the understanding of being or something, right? Where something's not like, it's this conversation is in some sense a recovery, right? For something that was before, but being realized in it being present as origin, just that sense of what we're reaching into. So as I think about that, like, and then I think about, oh, okay, so this is what I'm doing in. Okay, cool.
Hey, fantastic.
Clear. Right on. Check.
It's 7 o'clock.
That's what this whole thing is. I'm doing. Yeah. Yes.
We just did a Moebius loop and then came back around and boom. I like that.
I think Chris wanted to say something though.
Yeah.
Gone. It's okay. Yeah. It was here and it's gone.
So I just want to gather something for myself here, if possible.
Yep. Let's gather.
Sounds like we've got the gradation, like there's something like dynamic coupling, and that makes dialogue possible. And then I think there's this deep interweaving between dialogue and narrative. That's what I'm hearing Gregg saying, right? And then what Chris is saying is, but within that interweaving has like almost a self-exacting function, a self-transcending function, because it wants to go beyond itself into something like dialogos. And the thing about dialogos with Gregg's wisdom energy is it's simultaneously reaching up and reaching down. It's reaching down through dialogue and into dynamical coupling so that it can be re-exacted up. That's what this is starting, how this is starting to gather together for me.
Which kind of maps on. It kind of maps like the bidirectionality of it. I think of a Janus-faced Socrates, that on the one side he's actually gathering the narrative together, only so that he can actually direct its arrow through into an environment where it's suddenly going to scatter.
Yeah.
Right? Because like
Oh,
think of how the Socratic
yeah.
dialogue structured, right? Think of like at the beginning of the Socratic, he meets his interlocutor, yeah, right? The eponymous
Yeah.
person of the dialogue, and he spends a good chunk of the time, Socrates, basically like giving a biography of his interlocutor, either to the interlocutor or to somebody else who's present, right? He basically gathers up the narrative just so he can deliver it unto the aporia. But the gathering of the narrative is very important before he delivers it unto the aporia, because he has
but it has an ironic edge to it,
eye
right?
trained backwards on the collection of the narrative, and then one eye trained on the recollection of the narrative within the broader, within the kind of the telescoping meaning of the dialogue into what it becomes.
But the thing is, though, right? The gathering in the narrative, and that's all a repeated refrain in Plato, is that autobiography is given ironically, because what often happens is the Socratic dialogos reveals that person's autobiography does not actually match the machinery of their character at all. They have this wonderful autobiography about how they're courageous and brave, and they turn out to be cowards, right?
And in the
a profound
irony,
way.
and when the irony is realized
exactly.
in that moment where the self is the ineffable somehow, and it shows. See, this is what keeps I keep thinking about, because I'm along with you, John, reading the Neoplatonics about this sense about this like the ineffability of something and how necessary that seems to be, right? That there's something about that I keep getting this sense of that there's a sense in everything that you just said, John, that it's somehow showing the ineffable without stealing its nature from it or something, right?
Because there's the ineffable space between your autobiography and your character. The aporia reveals to people that space, and you can't, if you narrate it back in, you've lost the point. The point is to see, right? To be in that space outside of your autobiography and see that, wow, my character actually doesn't match this narrative.
But that's what gives the false narrative its, sorry, Greg.
No,
I'll be quick. That's what gives the false narrative its enduring value to the process, right? It stands to ironize. It stands in reference, but only an ironic reference to that which is like it basically provides a rudder, right? It provides something to work against. It provides something to opt away from.
I mean, in late 1996, when I really was honing in on this justification, what I call justification hypothesis, was really weird. I mean, it was really weird. And the reason was, it was like, oh my God, I'm just a justifier. In other words, it's like all of a sudden you step outside and you're like, my whole life has just been basically, I then call myself and others a verbal, you're just a verbal. Which means that we think that we reify these narratives, but basically we're just enacting a particular kind of BS construction that legitimizes what we're doing, which I think is very similar to what Socrates, I mean, I come at it from a different angle, but it's sort of like the awakening to, oh my God, we don't know anything. We're just engaged in bullshit. I mean, it's that terror, basically, right? And then once you realize the depth of the potential bullshit, then what? No, it's basically philosophy, right? It's like, now what?
That's well said.
I think one way of kind of depicting it is just it's the dispelling of the false memory in service of a greater remembering.
Right.
Who you are speaks so. Is that phrase? Is it Keats? Who you are speaks so loudly I can't hear a word you're saying. I was thinking about through some of our conversations.
Oh, that's good.
Nice.
Chris is like, maybe the way to translate that Heraclitus fragment is like where it says, rather than don't listen to me, listen to the logos. Instead of listening to just me, listen through me to the logos. There's this kind of through quality that we somehow return back to something that if we just stay at the story or the narrative, right, or the conversation doesn't go deeper, we don't get to see how it's ironic, but also transcendent and pointing to something beyond it, to the logos itself.
Love it. Yep.
So that's kind of the
Yeah,
sense of
perfect.
because I keep just listening. To me, there's something so key about listening around this stuff, right? Of that there is this way that like you can listen to somebody through the story that they're saying, and you can listen to their story, but you can also start to hear, well, what are the concerns that have them articulate it like this? And then you can start to hear of like what kind of being would be concerned like that. And then you can find it all the way through to where you start to realize and you start to see, oh, there's a world that's inevitable to their articulation that they're responding to, that's prior to what they're saying. That then when you speak that to them, they have like a spiritual experience of like, oh my God, that's everything.
That's me
but
doing
somehow
good,
listening just
clinical work.
follows that all the way through. If you just do it.
Well, because what happens when you do, I call it directive empathy in a particular tactic that I do, directive empathy, is because, and essentially what's happening is I am honing in on the narrative, the justification narrative, but I can also then track the filter dynamics, that then has this justificatory narrative on top of the perspectival, participatory, procedural, developmental creature, right? That is the core phenomenological self, and the interrelationship between that core phenomenological self and the private narrator says, I hope what I am, and then what tries to put out here, and the disharmony between all of that. And then to have a mirrored person that actually then says, hey, this is what I'm hearing you trying to say in the story you're constructing and the action that you're doing and your felt sense of being. And if that drops and provides an intersection of coherence, then you get an affective flooding. Oh my God, I get in touch with something. And then you get a sense of calm because there's this inter-new grip between the domains.
Inter-new grip.
Like an optimal grip. Is that what you mean?
Well, it's an upgrade because of all the entanglements that are pulling against each other, and then there's a release. And then there's a unfreezing and a reconsolidating, and then all of a sudden the person will feel the
catching of the virtue that speaks beyond itself.
The burden upon me was released, and I feel so much freer.
And that's the vulnerability, I think, is probably affectively a big part of that process. Because it's like you're finding the hidden drama within, beyond and beneath the narrative.
And the opposite of the vulnerability is the defense. I'm not going to be vulnerable. I'm not vulnerable. I'm fine. I'm not going there. Those are all structures of defense to try to maintain homeostasis, but also maintain the broken, fragmented, part-based structures rather than transcend that.
Totally. And there's something about the listener in that when you're listening to somebody through that you're actually performing some kind of move that is not just, I'm listening to you. There's something that you end up somehow in that you actually end up, it seems like I think it's the practice of listening to the logos, literally, right? That sense in which you're participating in such a way where you're no longer over here, and it's not just I'm empathetic with you, and it's not just that I'm in your position, but at some point it becomes something, we both get an insight, right? It's not your insight, it's not my insight. It's like insight has happened, and we return from the sense of it going like, oh, wow, we just went through something. It's so
Gregg and I had one of those in our series, a very powerful and important one. Very much.
Amen.
This is really great.
Kind of energy, guys.
Yep, it's been a good 2 hours.
So this is what I'm going to be doing. Okay, thank you for helping me out with that. It's good to have good friends.
Cultivate a circle that catches the virtue and moves it forward.
That very much. I wanted to say, of course, we were exemplifying.
Yeah, and there's new tensions in me. I can tell, I can feel them from these conversations. Like tensions have been resolved, but it's opened up new ones that I can just tell I'm gonna find out I'm gonna be walking inside of, and they're gonna start peeking through, and you'll get a phone call from me to have more conversations. Right? I could just feel some of the
We'll circle back.
edges. Yeah,
It will call us forth and we can circle back.
yeah. Right on. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Always, always a very great pleasure.
Yeah.
Amen.
Yeah,
Cool.
thanks, gents. This was fun.
Oh,
Yes, very much so. I look forward to our trialogues, and Guy, I look forward to
yes,
hanging out again soon.
absolutely. Mwah. Bye.